everyone. Welcome to my presentation today. It's going to be on Freya. My name is Morgan Daimler. I just showed everyone. I had a book that just came out through Moon Books called Pagan Portals Freya. Most of what I write through Moon tends to be more focused on Irish paganism, Irish deities, and then the good folk fairies as well. But I do have several books through Moon that are focused on Norse topics and deities. I have a book, Pantheon the Norse, I have a book on Odin, a book on Thor, and then Freya just came out actually a few weeks ago. So I'm excited to be talking about her here today. Covers who I am and why I'm here doing this. To talk about Freya, we need to sort of start with talking a little bit about the Norse gods themselves to kind of give some context and an explanation before we dive into the more Freya-specific material. So when we talk about the Norse gods, we are primarily talking about the Aesir. The Aesir is sort of the main group, or what we might call pantheon of the Norse gods. Don't really like using the name pantheon, the term pantheon, because I think it implies sort of more cohesion than we necessarily are going to find with a lot of more Western European cultures. It's true with the Irish. I think it's true with the Norse as well. They tend to get all lumped together and treated as if they're one sort of cohesive group. But we actually find is that there's a lot of diversity and a lot of regional variation. So pantheon, not my favorite word. But in this case, we are sort of taking that wider view with them. When we're talking about the Norse gods, pantheon, if you will, we are primarily talking about the Aesir and to a lesser degree, the Vanir. So who are they? Excellent question to start with. The Aesir are the primary gods, the primary deities that we know of that were acknowledged, honored, worshipped in Norse culture. And this would include everything from Germany up through Norway, Sweden, and over into Iceland. Obviously, I mentioned those regional variations, and that is kind of important because the names that we know different gods by are not the same across these different places. If you're looking, for example, at like German material, it's the same wider culture in the same way that the Celtic language speaking cultures like Ireland and Wales, and Gaul would all be sort of under this one umbrella or this blanket concept. But we have all these regional variations. And again, this is sort of an important thing to understand as we're getting into the topic of Freya, that we don't find her specifically in every one of these Norse cultures. We find her more in specific places and locations, and not necessarily in other places and locations. That all said, today we're talking in more general terms. If you want the more specifics, then I definitely recommend digging into the book or any really good book or academic material on Freya. But for our purposes, general terms. The Aesir are the main gods. The Vannic gods are mentioned. We know that they exist. We have references to them, but they were not, as a group, sort of the primary beings that were acknowledged in the Norse cultures, in Norse religion. What we find is that the Vedic gods that we are aware of, that we do know of, are ones who were sort of brought into the Aesir. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute, so hold that thought for a second. There are a lot of theories as to why, when we talk about the Norse gods, we have these two different groups that are kind of understood to be these primary groups of deities. The Aesir, of course, are the primary ones, but the Vanir, the Vannic gods, are also sort of understood to be really important. There's 9 worlds in Norse cosmology. generally understood to be 9 worlds anyway. The exact number, again, regional variations, we'll go with 9. And we have Asgard, which is the home of the Aesir, which is sort of the main place that people tend to think of associated with the gods. But we also have Vanaheim, which is the realm of the Vanir, literally home of the Vanir. So we know that they were significant beings. We know they were important enough to have their own world in this system of 9 different worlds. But we don't know a lot about them. And we specifically don't know a lot about them in their own context and in their own world. We just don't have a lot of those stories. They might have existed in the past. They just haven't survived to this time. They might also have just not been seen as that significant because the focus was on the Aesir. The Aesir were seen as the more important deities. There's different academic theories as to why this is. There is one particular theory which can be popular depending on which source you're looking at, that says that the Vanir were the older gods, the original gods in these areas, and that as different populations came in and settled or colonized or, whatever happened that brought them into those areas, they worshipped these gods, the Aesir. And so that's why we sort of have this double layer of gods going on. These two different, I guess we could almost say almost two different pantheons. And we also have a theory which is a little older. I don't know how many current people in academia really still favor this, but this idea that the Vanir represent sort of agriculture and agricultural interests and anything kind of relating to that, whereas the Aesir represent the concept of civilization and sort of the more intellectual aspect of things. And those two theories can work pretty well together. Some people will sort of argue them together, or you can kind of take them separately. But it puts us in this situation where we have these two different groups. And what happens in the mythology, what we learn, and this is in the Eddas, which are one of the sort of main stories that we have about these gods. This comes from Iceland. We have a story that tells us that these two groups ended up getting into a war with each other, specifically because a being named Golveg, and we'll definitely get back to Golveg in a little bit, but a being named Golveg had gone to the Aesir, and something had happened which had caused them to react very badly to Golveg's presence, and they attempted to kill her 3 times, and it did not work, or you could possibly argue that it did, and it just didn't stick. And she emerged after those 3 attempts with a new name, Heather, and sort of as a new being. Many people have argued that this story, that particular aspect of the story, is sort of an initiation tale, and that was the story of this being, this Golveg, being initiated and being moved into a different phase of being, we'll say. But Golveg was one of the Vanir. The Vanir did not appreciate the Aesir's treatment of Golveg, so it started a war, and the two groups fought against each other, were definitely not getting along, but also the war itself was sort of drawing out and not going well, and eventually a compromise was reached. And this compromise is something that we actually find in a lot of pre-Christian cultures. This was the actual practice that was done. So we have it in the story, but this is a reference to something that culturally would have been understood as a thing that people did. And what they did was they exchanged what's called peace hostages, which I realize we hear the word hostage in English that has a lot of connotations. Some of those apply here, but not necessarily all of them. So these are people who were exchanged from one culture, one group to another, with the idea that they would be part of the other group and within the other group, and that their safety was assured by the second group taking care of the peace hostages that they had. So the status quo was kind of maintained by having this exchange. The Aesir sent 2 people to the Vanir, which is a whole separate story and does not go particularly well for them. But I will not tell that story now because that is not to do with Freya. And the Vanir, meanwhile, sent 2 hostages as well to the Aesir. And they sent a god named Njorth. Njorth is connected to the sea, to the ocean, to commerce related to that. And with Njorth went his son, Freyr. Now, Freyr had a sister. Njorth had a daughter. Both of those things at the same time. And this is Freya. So her father and brother were sent as peace hostages to the Aesir. Freya seems to have gone on her own willingly with her father and brother. In the story, it kind of reads almost as if she was also one of these hostages, but she was not. It was a 2-for-2 exchange. Njorth and Freyr were exchanged for Hoyer and Muir went to the Vanir. And when we see later on lists of who are the Aesir, who are counted among the Aesir, we see these 3 Vanic deities included with the Aesir. Freya is very specifically listed with, they're called Aesir, the Norse goddesses. Freya is counted among them as if she were one of them, even though she is herself from this other group, this Vanic group, which I realize is a little confusing, but this is just how the system works. So she is a Vanic goddess. She is one of these more, I suppose we could say primal, more agriculturally connected goddesses, but she is counted among the Aesir, those more, again, if we're going with that theory, more civilization-oriented beings. So she kind of straddles this liminal space between them. And she has some very interesting things to do among the Aesir. Although I will say that we don't have a lot of stories that are still around where Freya is taking a more active role in a way that sort of intersects with important things that the Aesir are doing. We do have some stories of Freya going out and doing significant things, but often they're more solo focuses for her. For example, we have a very, very fun story, which I encourage everyone to read, about Freya going to the underworld, to Helheim, and trying to find this giantess, the seeress, who can give her some answers. And she does this riding on this great boar. She gets down there, finds the seeress, and asks her to explain the whole lineage of this particular human. And it eventually comes out that she wants to know this because this particular human has made so many offerings to her, so many prayers to her. They use the analogy that the altar he had built for her is like glass because it's covered with so many offerings. And these would have been liquid offerings. And it also comes out that the boar that she rode to get there is that human who she has shape-shifted into a boar. So he's kind of earning his answer. And he needs to know what his old lineage is for his own reasons in the story. But that is clearly a more active example of Freya getting out there and doing something. But in that particular story, it's really, she's doing something that's focused on her own goals, if you will. Whereas we have a lot of other mythology that involves Freya that is more specifically connected to the Aesir and sort of their wider goals or their wider stories. She tends to be more passive in those contexts. So, for example, We see her in several stories where giants come to Asgard for various reasons, sometimes offering to do something like build a wall around the whole place, other times sort of demanding something or threatening violence. And they ask for a specific payment, either in the case of building the wall, a specific payment, or in order to not go through with whatever threat they're making. And that payment, in multiple examples, is the sun, the moon, and Freya. The sun and the moon in Norse myth are personified. They're not just celestial objects, they're also people. The moon is a god named Mani. The sun is a goddess named Suna. So, just for clarification, when they're demanding the sun, the moon, and Freya, the sun and the moon are also people and Freya. And it shows kind of the significance of Freya in the mythology, in the stories. Even though in that story she is not actively doing anything, she is effectively the price that's being demanded, or part of it. And she is as important as the sun and the moon, which is extremely significant if you really stop and think about it. Like, that's how much she meant. And again, in the actual stories, they never spell out why Freya would be that important. Why would she have so much significance that her value is equal to the sun and the moon? However, a lot of scholars have sort of theorized that it relates to her connection, again, to that Vanic principles, that sort of agricultural, earth, primeval principle, that she has connections to fertility, and specifically to fertility relating to like crops and animals, that her presence would be something that would have encouraged abundance and bounty. And I'm trying to explain this as carefully as I can, because I do think nowadays we have this very specific idea when we hear someone talking about the concept of fertility or a deity connected to fertility. We have a specific idea of what that means. And I think in the case of Freya, it's true and it's applicable, but maybe not in that more stereotypical way that some people might imagine. She is connected to fertility in the sense that her presence, or she has the ability to cause things to be fruitful and abundant and prosperous, which clearly is something that you can understand why the giants and anybody else would want to have that. And it also might explain why she has always seemed to be a very popular goddess. She is one in the older material that we do find reference in a lot of stories. She is one even in folklore into the modern era, into Christian times. We have her referenced in stories. There are plants named after her. She clearly had a great deal of significance and still continues to have that. She is probably one of the most popular, if not the most popular, of the Norse goddesses today. She's certainly one of the ones that the most people, I think, would be familiar with or recognize her name. And I should probably just quickly note, as I'm talking about this, that I did choose on the book to go with the more modern sort of English standardized spelling, Freya. This is not the older spelling, and it's not the spelling within the cultures that Freya is from and continues to exist in. So you'll also see her name spelled Freya, I believe it is. I am dyslexic, so I might be reversing the Y and the J, but you will often see it with that spelling. Some people consider that to be the more genuine or more legitimate spelling. Just putting that out there. I chose not to go with that purely because I felt that the widest possible audience would recognize the names with this spelling, including the people who use the J. They're still in that business. So, still extremely popular today. She is known across a whole range of different demographics, modern heathens, Asatru, Norse pagans, people who are into different types of paganism or witchcraft, also often will acknowledge Freya. She's appeared in modern TV shows. She's appeared in modern book series, even young adult book series. So she's just very culturally significant, I think. And she has been and continues to be. It probably says a great deal about Freya and about her energy and who she is as a goddess, that she continues to be so popular today and across such a wide range of different people, different groups, different cultures. Certainly people in the UK and the United States are very aware of Freya, I think, and she clearly has a great deal of cultural and historic significance in places like Iceland, Norway, Sweden. She's just very well known. I will also quickly add her name is not actually probably her name. So her brother, Freyr, we know from other sources that his actual name was Yngve, Yngve Freyr. Freyr means Lord, and Freya means lady. And they were clearly titles that were used for these two beings. We have references, as I just said, to what his proper name would have been. Hers, however, has been lost. We don't know anymore if she had another name, what it was. Maybe one day someone will stumble across it in some obscure source somewhere. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of the time, and this is true with pretty much all older cultures as far as I'm aware of, is that things get lost over time. Manuscripts don't survive, art's copied, we lose sources, oral stories fall out of favor and end up being forgotten. So, for example, in the Norse, there are multiple places, particularly like if we look at, for example, the Icelandic sagas, where they will make references to what would have at the time that was being written would have been very popular stories people told. And we have no idea what that story is. It hasn't survived to today. We only have these snippets of references in other sources. And it seems likely that Freya's name kind of falls into that category. It's unlikely that her original name was Lady, her brother's name being Lord. Possible, but I think unlikely. Most likely she did have another name and we just don't continue to have it. She's certainly not the only goddess who has that issue. I'm 100% looking at the Morgan when I say that. So these things do happen. But we do know that she was important, significant, and that her name is a title. She and her brother clearly have a very strong connection because their names are so interconnected. There have been a lot of theories suggesting that they represent like a divine twin pairing. To be clear, there's nothing in the original source material that suggests they were twins. They certainly are siblings. That is referenced in multiple places. Kind of not even a question. Could they be twins? Certainly. There's nothing in the source material that contradicts that. They do, at least according to the Lokasena, if I remember correctly, they do have the same mother, which would be North's sister. At least in that source, they have the same mother and father, so we know they're full siblings. It's possible they were twins. We just don't know. Again, if this is something that used to be believed or in the original cultures, we've lost any references to it. But it does fit with a wider Indo-European pattern. Indo-European is the culture that sort of the Norse culture had come out of. And in the European material, we know that there is this pattern of cultures having specific, I don't want to say categories because that's not quite right, but types, I guess we would say, of deities. And divine twins are a really common thing. It's something that's found in a lot of these cultural groups. So there's certainly a persuasive argument for Freya and Freya being twins. They definitely seem to have very closely related things that they would have been prayed to for, or, offered to for. I also mentioned that Freyr is one of the 3 most popular, historically, Norse deities. He's the only Vannic deity that takes that, alongside Thor and Odin. There was a temple in Sweden that had statues for those 3 specifically. We also know that there was the practice where one of his priestesses would go around the land with a priest, I should say, of his, with a wagon, sort of a traveling Freyr show. He is also very connected to fertility, very similar concepts. He is also very strongly connected to the Alfar, elves, Norse cultural elves. It was said that they also have their own worlds, Loselfheim, Light Elfholm, and it was said that world, that entire world, the elves in it, were given to Freyr as a tooth gift when he lost his first tooth, as a gift. So he is considered to be the lord of those beings, and the Alfar are, in general, associated with things like good weather, sunshine, all of that. So just lots of interrelated concepts going on when we look at these groups of deities, the way that they connect. I do think it's hard to understand Freya without understanding her brother, because they're sort of so intrinsically connected, whether they are twins or not. Now, I do also want to quickly mention that there is an ongoing debate that will probably never be ended and can be a really great way to start a quick fight in heathen focus groups about whether or not Freya and Freya are the same deity or are different deities. And the academic opinions are pretty equally divided on this as well. The names, the etymology of the names is very similar. And it's similar in a way that people can certainly argue for an overlap, and that these were originally perhaps one goddess who was later sort of divided and took on these 2 characters, avatars, whatever we might call it. I will say up front that I am personally not a fan of this theory. I tend to think that Freya is Freya and Frigg is Frigg, and the 2 have some crossover and overlap, but I don't personally think that they are actually the same goddess. However, in the interest of fairness for everyone attending this discussion for MoonCon 23, I am putting out there that this has sort of been an ongoing debate for a very long time, which will probably never end. It does not help that the main areas where Freya is known, Freya is really not, and the main areas where Freya is known, Freya is really not, so that makes it a little more difficult, really, to sort of sort all of this out. Whatever you think about it is perfectly fine, because like I said, there's a lot of strong arguments on both sides of this, but I do think it's another thing to sort of consider when we're talking about Freya and who she is and getting to know her, that she has this sort of thing going on with Frigg. Part of that, one of the key arguments behind that, has to do with specifically who Freya's husband is. So Freya, for the bulk of mythology, the bulk of stories that we have with her, really is not with a partner per se. We do see her, for example, the story of Brisingamen, where she's taking lovers. In the Lokasenna, it's referenced that she was a very strong person who was very comfortable taking whoever she chose to her bed. Just not the way Loki says it in that story, because he is very feisty in that story. But it is something that we do see in one story specifically. This idea that Freya has a husband, that her husband's name is Ohar, that he has kind of wandered off, disappeared, and no one really knows where he is. The story talks about how Freya has been searching for him and crying because she can't find him, crying tears of gold. But we really don't have anything else much about him. There is a Victorian era story by Gruber, which talks about her finding him, but that was an invention of that author. I think it's important to note because some people run across that and think it's genuine. It's, I guess, modern folklore, we might say, but it's not older material. What we have in the older material is just this idea that her husband at some point disappeared, and we don't know what happened to him. She doesn't find him again. They do have a daughter together, one assumes before he wandered off. But the reason that I'm emphasizing all this is that her husband's name, Othar, is fairly similar to Odin. And even to the point that etymologically there's some crossover there. Odin, of course, is known for wandering off. He usually comes back, though. And there is a story about Frey. I believe this is the Anglo-Saxon story, again, if I'm remembering correctly, so feel free to jump in the comments and correct me if I am misremembering this, where Odin wanders off and Frey is left to sort of handle things while he's gone, ends up either sleeping with or marrying, depending on how you want to look at Odin's two brothers. Odin does come back, and then that causes some ruckus, as it were. But people sort of compare these two as one of the points to argue that Frigga and Freya are the same goddess. Freya has this husband, Ohar, who wanders off. She can't find him. And then Frigg, of course, is married to Odin, and he is known for sort of wandering off. And then you have this one particular story where he does that for a period of time, does eventually come back. But there's enough similarity with the stories, and there's enough similarity in the names that it sort of creates this gray zone in belief where people aren't 100% sure what is going on. Now, like I said, me personally, I don't tend to favor this theory. I think that when we look at who Freya is, she very clearly has associations that Frigga would not. And that we look at Frigga also has some associations that Freya clearly does not. And I think there is overlap, but not enough. And I think they were probably distinct deities. Maybe if we go back far enough, Proto-Indo-European, they have one root deity that they came from, but it's not something that continues, in my opinion, into the period where we have the stories about them. Is Ohar Odin? Is Frigg Freya? Not in my opinion, but again, there's certainly people out there, including scholars out there, who will argue the exact opposite of everything I just said. Kind of have to draw your own conclusion. One of Freya's main connections, one of the main things that she is known for, this is historically, this is also something that we find today, is this connection with something called Seher. I apologize, by the way, if I'm mispronouncing some of these terms. I speak a very small amount of Icelandic, which is closely related to Old Norse, but my pronunciation is certainly not necessarily 100%. So take that with a grain of salt and maybe double check how I'm pronouncing things. But either way, Freya has this connection to this practice that's called Seher. I told you we would be circling back around to Golbeg and Heather at the beginning. We have arrived. So when Golbeg is burned, is what happens with the Aesir, transfixed transfixed on spears and burned, and comes back as Hyther. Hyther then is said to travel the world and teach this particular type of magic called Seher to women. And what Seher is a little hard to quickly explain. I could probably do an entire 40-minute presentation just on that. It's sometimes translated into English as witchcraft. I think you kind of have to just call it what it is in the original language because the nuances get lost. It is not witchcraft like we understand witchcraft today in any sense. It was particular practices connected to things like manipulating the weather, influencing people's minds and perceptions. One of the more famous stories we have that involves sacred being practiced is a woman, a Sith called a Sith woman, who tries to hide her adult son from some men who are looking for him for very nefarious purposes. And when the men come into the room she's in, she's told her son to kind of sit and not move. I believe he has a bag over his head, not move. And she casts this illusion on the minds of the men that he is not there, that it's like a broom propped up in the corner. And that's what she tells them effectively, my son is not here. They leave, but as soon as they're sort of out of her influence, they remember what they were looking for and they go back. This happens several times until one of them kind of catches on that she's using this particular type of magic to influence them. And that it does not end particularly well for her, or her son. But that's sort of what Seher is. It's kind of connected to this idea of influencing minds, influencing perceptions, influencing weather. There's aspects of it that are sometimes connected to maybe ideas of shape-shifting. So it's a very specific type of thing as opposed to a more general maybe practice of witchcraft as we understand it. And Hyther that is said to be teaching this to human women wandering around the world. Now, Freya, in another source, is described as teaching this exact same thing to Odin. She is strongly associated with it herself, this particular type of magic, and engaging in this particular practice. There has been a lot of supposition that Golveg, towards Hyther, might actually be Freya, that those are just other names for her. And I should have really said at the beginning that part of what makes a lot of this with the Norse material particularly fun is that deities always have by-names. By-names are sort of these other names that they're known by, not nicknames because they can be very, very different. Odin has like 200 of them, something like that. Just completely different names that he is known by, and it is understood that this is still him, but this is a name he's known by in a particular story, in a particular disguise, that sort of a thing. So Freya, we know, has several different by-names herself. She's also called Seer, she's called Vanadis. We know for certain that she does have these other names. We don't know for certain that Hyther is one of her names, or that Golveg was one of her names. Much like the is Freya Frigg discussion, it's unclear whether this is actually a connection or whether this is something that just might be a connection. Certainly, again, if we look at the names, there's some ways you can argue based on the meaning of the names that it does connect with Freya. This connection with Seher is another sort of potential clue, but we just don't know for certain. We have no way to know for certain if they're definitely connected. It certainly seems likely, and we do know that Freya, at the very least, much like Hyther, was going around and teaching Seth, that she specifically taught it to Odin. Sorry, I keep going back and forth between how I'm pronouncing these, whether I'm using the more modern Americanized pronunciations or some of the older ones, so I apologize for that as well. It's a bad habit. I'm trying to use the more modern Americanized versions of the names because I know that's what people are more familiar with. Sometimes I'm just slipping up, so I apologize for that. But this practice of Savior is sort of a key aspect of who Freya is. And it's this type of magic that she's very strongly connected with. In more modern terms, even in some of the older folklore, she is very associated with witches because of this magic that's a strong thing for her. Now it's been a little over 40 minutes. I did want to leave some time for questions. I don't know if we actually have any questions. I've been trying to pack a lot of information to a short amount of time. So I'm just going to give it 1 sec to see if anyone has any questions. Put them in the chat, or the person moderating this talk can pass them on to me. Otherwise, I will just keep talking about Freya for the few minutes that we have left. And then we'll wrap it up. I have really only been able to touch on like the absolute bare basics of any of this. And I feel like I'm doing a bit of a disservice to the goddess because there is so much more to who and what Freya is. It's just impossible to get into all of it in such a short time frame. I will say, if you are interested in the book, it is a Pagan portal, so it's a fairly short book as well. It's only about 100 pages. It is not meant to be sort of the ultimate Freya reference. It's meant to be an introduction to her, and it lists sources that you can go to from here to learn more about Freya. There's another great book about Freya by an author called File for people who are really interested in Freya. You can also, if you come up with questions after this, please feel free to contact me on social media. I know sometimes we hear a discussion or a talk and we think about it for a little bit and then we start to wonder about something. So by all means, if that happens, feel free to just reach out in that context. Okay, I do see we have a question. Thank you, Heather. Do you plan to write more in-depth book about Freya? I haven't been planning on it, but I am certainly open to doing so. If it seems like that is something people have a real interest in. When I wrote my Pagan portal on the Morgan, I did not intend to follow that up in any way, and then I ended up writing Raven Goddess, which was continuing on. So that is certainly a possibility, a thing that could happen. The nice thing about the Pagan portals is because they're meant to be introductory books, it's meant to cover a lot of things with enough that you'll have, hopefully, a decent understanding of those topics and of those connections, but there's certainly room to go further and to go into more depth and explore more. And because there is so much with Freya, you could probably write a 300-page book about her and still not cover everything. That's just an awesome thing about her. She has a lot going on. I did not even get into a story I had planned to talk about, which is how she gets her famous necklace on Brisingamen. I did not get into talking about her relationship with Loki, which is, I think, worth discussing. Her possession of the Falcon Cloak. I mean, there's so much more to her, really, than what I had time for here. But hopefully this discussion has at least provided an introduction to the introduction for Freya, and at least given people a place to start in understanding her and the Norse gods more generally. And I am just about out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. I will say you can find me on Moon Books, Collect Inc. I have a lot of books I've written for them, so if the Norse material interests you, I have a couple about that. Otherwise, I've got a lot about the Irish end of things and the good folk. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and sadly all the other social medias that are out there at this point. I really appreciate everyone who came today to listen to my talk, and hope everyone has a great day.